On November 12th, 2002, after their surprisingly successful remake of the first Resident Evil title, Capcom decided to release a prequel to Resident Evil 1 entitled Resident Evil 0, which was also initially an exclusive Nintendo 64 video game that unfortunately wasn't finished until its assets were entirely recreated. I have so much to say about the story of Resident Evil 0. Because the entire story of Resident Evil 0 is ultimately a fucking waste. The first time that I played this game, I ignored every sign. It took me this fucking long to realize that it was a huge mistake. Firstly, I must absolutely address the train introduction. Not only at this point are we immediately introduced to the main antagonist, but the information provided by this character later is the same information that fucks up the first game's story. The introduction begins with James Marcus praying on a train while standing on a mountain as if he's praying to the moon, and decides to infect everybody on board by unleashing hordes of leeches. I highly suggest that you remember that. That small information will be very important later. What makes this even more interesting is that there's hardly any subtlety. If he really wanted to spectate and make it less obvious, he could have at least remained in the shadows and not have been so damn flamboyant with his outfit. Anyway, 2 hours later, the Bravo team from STARS decides to investigate. This includes half of the cast that's introduced in the first game, some of which that are hardly ever seen often because they're either entirely separated, don't have enough time, or die. Once again, this is something that I highly suggest that you remember, because it will be very important information later. Rebecca finds the train, and for some goddamn reason, nobody with an inch of intelligence decides to follow her, despite the fact that their helicopter is down and there's potential endangerment among everybody. It might sound weird to complain about this, but upon the train sequence happening, it becomes obvious why nobody should have been separated, especially since Enrico is on this team. Rebecca discovers that there's a zombie outbreak on the train and slowly realizes that her teammates are being brutally fucking murdered after noticing how she isn't entirely alone. Rebecca should have immediately contacted the surviving members of her squad and told them everything, especially after Dewey's demise. But no, Rebecca decides to follow Billy Cohen because she knows about his story and is forced into a situation where she has to cooperate with him. This crazy fucking introduction is halfway finished, and still Rebecca hasn't fucking made the effort to contact anybody. Now let's look at this for a moment. I understand that this is not the first time that characters are separated in a Resident Evil title. I've seen this before many times. But Resident Evil 0 should have made it obvious that Rebecca shouldn't have gone on the train by herself. And if she ever did make contact with zombies or Billy Cohen, she could have at least made the effort to say something on her radio. At least talking about the zombies and Dewey's death would have made it easier for everybody to regroup somewhere. Because at some point during the train sequence, Enrico contacts Rebecca and tells her what he knows about Billy. However, at no point do either of these characters make the single effort to talk about where the fuck they are. It may sound easier said than done due to the circumstances on the train, but motherfucker, are you serious? I know that motherfucking radio works! Don't give me any bullshit about the radio somehow not working. The signals were fine. Because Rebecca's helpless and petite ass is always calling for help. Across the entire motherfucking map! Just thinking about that brings an even bigger question. Why in the fuck did she not have one conversation with Enrico after leaving the treatment plant with Billy? Do you have any idea how much bullshit could have been avoided if she said something? You cannot seriously try to convince me that Enrico and the remainder of the Bravo team somehow immediately made it to the mansion. I refuse to believe that they did not have enough time to contact Rebecca. One conversation alone would have been enough to have everybody on alert. Instead of being concerned about Billy, Rebecca should have been more curious about the remainder of her squad, considering that not only were there more people, but they were all separated before she entered the train. Also, because one person from her group is already fucking dead. Where the fuck was Enrico? We never see where he leaves to. He never talks to anybody after that. In the middle of all of this, a mysterious cleanup crew arrive on the train and are immediately wiped out by the leeches. I must go in detail about this, because it's a common trend in Resident Evil. And also because it's fucking ridiculous and a completely wasted subplot. Somehow this cleanup crew discovered that there is an outbreak on this train. How is it that they got overpowered by leeches, but had everything that they needed to kill them? If they didn't know anything about the leeches and only arrived to kill the zombies, what fucking difference would it make if the outbreak happened because of that? But hold on. It gets worse. Not only was this completely fucking ridiculous and irresponsible, but Umbrella could have seriously saved a lot of time and recruits by sending in a horde and having this shit already resolved elsewhere. I'm not saying this because realistically things would be very different. I'm saying this because if they wanted assurance that the mission would be completed, they should have sent more people and had more weaponry. What was the point sending these guys if their only purpose was to die? I don't see why every time in every Resident Evil installment, they're constantly subjected to horrific deaths without given one chance to thrive. It's embarrassing to see them constantly getting their asses literally beaten and eaten. The last thing that I'd like to discuss regarding the story mostly involves Rebecca and Marcus and possibly Billy. Because upon moving into Resident Evil Remake, everything changes. The problem with both of these games connecting is that the information provided is very conflicting. The original introduction to the first Resident Evil installment briefly mentions the Bravo team. We never actually learn about all of them until the Alpha team actually enters the mansion. None of their whereabouts and fates are revealed until the mansion has been completely investigated. The first time that you're introduced to the deaths of the other members of the squad, it involves people that you've never seen Rebecca interact with enough from Resident Evil 0. Some of which that should have actually interacted with her instead of just Billy, because then at least the story would have had more layers. That's just one part of the problem. Rebecca never talks to anybody about this shit. There's never a conversation about any of the events from Resident Evil 0. Not a single conversation about previous events or her comrades. The ending of Resident Evil 0 implies that Rebecca reaches the mansion. Rebecca is either offering assistance to Chris and other characters, or being a complete damsel in distress. I don't give a fuck if this is a new story. Why would Rebecca go through all that shit just to completely forget it later? Aside Rebecca's problem, everything about Marcus and Billy are completely fucking irrelevant. For Marcus, it's a bigger problem. Because since Resident Evil 0 reveals that he's the reason the outbreak happened, none of this shit is acknowledged by Wesker. The leeches are never relevant in the first Resident Evil installment. And it completely destroys the first installment's mystery and strength. If Marcus were actually responsible for the T-virus outbreak, then why wasn't this subplot introduced before? William Birkin and Albert Wesker know about this. They're both involved in this. So what kind of fucking amnesia did anybody have in this game that caused them to not remember this? Lastly, there's no investigation or whereabouts of Billy ever in later installments. We never know where the fuck he went after leaving Rebecca and knowing if he survived whatever happened in Raccoon City past Resident Evil 2 and 3. Rebecca never tells anybody, including Enrico before he dies, about what happened to Billy. Someone by then could have fucking found him. Unless he went completely fucking AWOL in society and decided that nobody could ever see his face again. What this game lacks the most, aside consistency, is replay value. Why the fuck was Leech Hunter the only mode unlocked when this game initially was released on the GameCube? I did not like any moment of this mode, because at no point did I feel like I was rewarded properly. I don't like the fact that I'm forced to collect all of these goddamn leeches, specifically by color in Billy and Rebecca's inventory spaces, while also defeating hordes of enemies, thus losing a fuckload of ammo and health items in the process, while also assuring that I have enough room later. Because once I start collecting a certain amount of leeches, they're permanently in their inventory until I actually end the entire fucking session. The amount of times that Billy and Rebecca were incapable of living and collecting these stupid fucking leeches just because I accidentally came into contact with an unfair horde of overpowered enemies, or being sidetracked into a fucking random maze leading into an area that doesn't have anything that I'm seeking, annoyed the fuck out of me. But that's not even the worst part. It's not just the fact that these motherfucking leeches are permanently in their inventory, but if you don't collect a certain amount of leeches, you have to redo the entire goddamn minigame, and assuring that Billy and Rebecca don't die. There's something very odd about Resident Evil Zero's puzzle structure, which initially doesn't seem like a hassle until you actually begin playing it. The majority of the puzzles require characters being entirely separated or together in the same area, which also somehow fucking applies to boss fights. Some people could see this as an advantage, but if you've played the other installments, you would find it weird that this game conveniently forces you to utilize two characters. Mostly with Billy because he's overpowered and some of the puzzles require his strength. On numerous occasions, Billy has to do certain things first before Rebecca. And if Rebecca is first, she's the one leading the way for him. So it's essentially Billy stealing the spotlight from Rebecca, even though she's the main protagonist of the story. And there's no cooperative mode for 2 players. Even if by any chance you're completely familiar with the format of Resident Evil, it's not fucking difficult to realize how stupid this was. I know how the fuck RPGs work, but I shouldn't be forced to constantly switch between these characters. Why is Billy capable of doing more than Rebecca, but can't fucking mix herbs? Another thing about Resident Evil Zero's mechanics that bothered the fuck out of me was its reliance on not using item boxes. In most Resident Evil games, item boxes helps organize items. But in Resident Evil Zero, there's geniuses that decided that there's no reason to have item boxes in favor of dropping every fucking thing that's collected on the ground. At first, this doesn't seem annoying, but there's so many items that you have to have in your inventory. There's only 6 inventory slots, and somehow, despite all of this fucking open space, they're incapable of dropping all of these goddamn items to collect something that's obviously vital to another area. I had no fucking pleasure constantly switching characters and dropping every item that I wanted in my fucking inventory. All just because somebody wanted this fucking wasteful and poorly implemented idea to emulate Sweet Home. To this day, after Resident Evil Zero's initial release, I'm still perplexed and impressed by this project. There's things that I admire about it, but otherwise couldn't accept because it wasn't planned ahead and ultimately turned out to be a big mistake. A mistake that could have been easily resolved if Capcom gave this project more time and at least tried to give it more connection to the other installments. So then it would at least feel like it was created with passion and not because there's a contract involved. The mistake that Capcom made that some people wouldn't have the balls to admit was having the game initially being a Nintendo 64 title. They clearly could have never achieved the vision that they got on the GameCube on the Nintendo 64 platform. It was very limited in memory and scope, so nobody could defend this and tell me otherwise. I think it's safe to say that if they remade Resident Evil 0 and 1 again, but completely conjoined the games together, so at least there'd be some goddamn consistency, a lot of this confusing shit could be resolved, and there wouldn't be any more glaring issues. But until that day happens, which I must say would be a very ballsy decision considering that I absolutely love Resident Evil Remake and thought that it was one of their biggest masterpieces of all time, this was the Venturous Gamer, and I hope you've enjoyed your Venturous experience. I paused the game and wanted some answers.